In this video, I'll explore, evaluate, and compare some different ways to cut circles and do it in kind of a fun format where I evaluate a do-it-yourself circle cutting jig and compare that to one that I purchased. The way the purchase jig works is you fix a workpiece to a sacrificial base and then use a plunge router pivoting around a center pin. Make several shallow passes until you cut all the way through. With the do-it-yourself jig, the jig is fixed and the workpiece is rotated around a center point, and it works on both the bandsaw and the router table. To do the evaluation, I'm going to cut 3 circles with each jig. A 9-inch circle, and then the largest circle possible to cut with the jig, and the smallest circle possible to cut with the jig. And all circles need to be cut with no center hole drilled in the workpiece. Then each jig will be evaluated against 6 reasons why one is better than the other, including how easy it is to set it up, how easy it is to use it, the accuracy and quality of the cut, what does it take to clean up afterwards, and the cost of the jig. So let's get started with the do-it-yourself jig first. To set up the DIY jig, I first install a 1/4-inch spiral compression bit in the router table. And then I install the jig's side rails on the router table and just make sure that the jig is centered and slides smoothly. It doesn't use the router table fence, but the fence has a dust collection port, which will be pretty handy to keep the work area clean. Then to set up the jig for use on the bandsaw, just use the miter slot expansion clamps to secure it to the bandsaw table. Now it's ready to be used. Setup was super easy. I'll give it 5 stars. I'll start with cutting a 9-inch circle by marking the center of the workpiece and then attaching the pivot cookie to the center of the workpiece with double-sided tape. The pivot cookie is what enables the ability to cut circles without drilling a centering hole in the workpiece. I set the jig pivot pin to the radius of the desired cut, which is 4.5 inches. Then set the workpiece on the jig and make the cut on the bandsaw by just pivoting the workpiece in a circle. The result is a pretty clean cut and a perfect circle, and depending on what you wanted to use this for, it might be good enough, no need to take it to the router table. However, any bandsaw cut is always a little rough, so to make an even cleaner cut, I take it over to the router table. This is just a really shallow pass for the purpose of making a clean cut, and it also dials in the exact diameter as set on the measuring tape on the jig. And just to confirm that the final dimension is exactly 9 inches as desired, and it's a really clean cut. I say this jig gets 5 stars for accuracy and cleanness of cut. The next test is to cut the largest circle this jig will do, so I set it to a 12-inch radius for a 24-inch diameter circle. Then the same procedure as before, attach the pivot cookie, and then the first cut is on the bandsaw. This workpiece is a lot larger, but still just as easy to cut as the 9-inch circle I did earlier. Then I move it over to the router table and clean up the edges. The result is a really clean cut, and once again the diameter is exactly as expected, this time at 24 inches. The smallest circle this jig will cut is 3 inches in diameter, so I set the pivot pin to a 1.5-inch radius. Same as before, I attach the cookie to the center of the workpiece and then cut the circle on the bandsaw. The small circle is a little trickier on the router table since I don't want my fingers that close to the router bit, so I attach some double-sided tape to a 2x2 to use to turn the circle. I have to admit it doesn't work great, and the quality of the cut on this piece isn't quite as good as the others, although it's still pretty good. The diameter is exactly 3 inches, just as expected. The jig is pretty straightforward to put away and clean up when I'm finished with it. Using the dust collection on the router table definitely helped prevent making a big mess, so I'll give it 5 stars for ease of cleanup. So let's move on to evaluate the purchased circle cutting jig. I start by installing a 1/4-inch spiral compression bit. It's the same router bit actually that I used on the DIY jig. Then I need to remove the base plate of my router and replace it with the jig, making use of the centering disc that comes with the jig, and then just remove the disc before using it. And then I clamp a sacrificial base to my workbench. This jig works by rotating the plunge router around a pin that goes in a drilled hole in the workpiece, but as per the rules of this competition, no drilled holes are allowed in the workpiece. So what I'm doing now is to convert the jig to a no-hole jig. I'm going to use the jig to cut 3 2-inch discs using the pin that came with the drill and drilling an 1/8 inch hole at the center of where I want each circle to be cut out of a piece of 1/2 inch plywood. One of these discs will be used as a rotating cookie, so very similar to the DIY jig, and the other two just to provide a lift offset to match the height of the rotating cookie. Okay, now it's ready to be used. That was quite a bit of effort just to get it set up and ready to use. I almost felt like I had to build a jig for the jig. But the 3 discs are good to reuse again, so not as much work next time I need to use it. I'll give it 3 or 4 stars for ease of setup. Now to cut the 9-inch circle for the jig evaluation. I first secure the workpiece to the sacrificial base using double-sided tape. Then mark the center point and attach the cookie to the center point with double-sided tape. The measurement scale on this jig is set to cut holes, not circles, and I'm using a 1/4 inch router bit, so I need to add a 1/2 inch to the dimension that I want. So I set it at 9.5 inches to get a 9-inch disc. I'm making multiple passes, each time increasing the depth of the cut until I get all the way through. This is a really clean cut and exactly 9-inch diameter, just as we were expecting. So I'll give it 5 stars in accuracy and cleanness of cut. Now to cut the small circle. This jig will cut as small as a 1-inch circle, but that's when you drill a hole in the workpiece. About as small as it'll cut with these no-hole spacers is a 3-inch circle. And just using the same procedure as before, I mark the center, attach the cookie, and cut the circle with multiple shallow passes. The result is great, and I'd say this jig might be a little better for small circles than the DIY jig. And finally, to cut the largest possible circle with this jig, which is 17 and 11/16. Once again, the cleanness and accuracy of cut is spot on, so 5 stars on both categories. After using the jig, besides the cleanup of the sawdust everywhere, I need to reinstall the router's base plate. Using a centering cone is really important and critical to make sure that the base plate is set back in the right place. I'm going to give this jig 4 stars for ease of cleanup. Now to summarize the results. I covered the majority of these ratings along the way, although one footnote I'd like to make is that the DIY jig cleanness of cut was probably better than the purchased jig for the mid-size and large circle, but only because the small circle was less than perfect, it got a 4 rating. These jigs are both really good choices, and it might come down to cost. The purchased jig is about $45. And the DIY jig isn't free. It took me about 3 to 4 hours to build and calibrate it, and I think that time has value. The DIY jig does also have some parts that you might need to purchase, but I didn't add up the cost specifically since I had some of the parts on hand. For example, the T-track and stick-on measuring tape were left over from when I built my miter station. For me, I'm happy to have either option available to use based on each individual project's needs. Thanks so much for watching, and if you think I've earned it, it'd be great if you hit that thumbs up like button and consider subscribing.